Good afternoon, everybody. This is Kelvin Willoughby. I'm a professor at the Skolkovo Institute of Science and Technology in Moscow, Russia. And today I'm talking about how intellectual property puts pressure on local innovative technology companies to go global. And let me give you my basic argument. And it stems from the fact that in the world of technology, it's necessary for a technology company to play on a global playing field. In other words, to pursue global markets in order to survive. This is because of the nature of modern technology, where most technologies are a component of a complex system and require a global market in order to generate sufficient revenue to survive. And it means that a local technology company must generate global revenue in order to survive on the local market. So let me elaborate on my argument slightly before I get into some empirical evidence to support what I'm talking about here. You know, even in a case where a company in a particular country, Russia, for example, has a technology which in principle can serve adequately the local market, it may need to go global. And this is because foreign companies working in the same or similar field may generate a substantial revenue from the global market and use that to invest in further development of the core technology and then compete against the local innovator in the local market. So, even if the local market in principle is big enough to support technology from a local technology company, that local technology must, in almost all cases, go international in order to survive. So international business and technology is necessary to survive in local markets. It's a bit of an irony, but that's the reality. And that means also pursuing intellectual property protection on a global scale. So let's talk about that in a bit more detail. Here we are today sitting in Russia, in Moscow, my home. I'm an American, but I live in Moscow and I'm a professor at a Russian university. Let's think about Russia's role in the world and how we should configure intellectual property and think about it to facilitate Russia's position. And we can think of Russia as analogous to any country that's addressing these questions. And one way to frame this issue is that we have a choice, and in fact, we do both. Here in Russia, we export products and services to other countries that are IP intensive. We also import IP intensive products and services. And the question is, what's the balance? And what's our vision for what the correct balance should be? Now, this is true not only for Russia, but Hong Kong, for example, Australia, United States, all countries face this question. I'm using Russia as an example here because it's our home. All right, let's think more deeply about this. One extreme is like this. We import IP-intensive products and services, technologies, primarily from foreign countries, and we export a smaller amount. And in fact, this is something like Russia's current situation. In fact, most countries in the world are like this. In Russia, we use oil and gas, for example, to pay for our import of IP-intensive products. So it looks like this. One extreme, we import a lot, we pay a lot, but we can afford to do it because we have other sources of income. Or there's another extreme where we think in the future, Russia may shift towards more of a technology innovative basis to its economy and trade, where we earn revenue from selling IP intensive products and services to the rest of the world. Is this a more attractive scenario? Perhaps. But what's wrong with this scenario? I mean, it looks attractive to me. The problem is it's not very realistic. Maybe something like this is closer to the ideal situation. So I think myself and many others living in Russia think about Russia's future in this way. Can we get a more balanced basis to the economy through international trade in technology intensive products and services? And that means using intellectual property accordingly to support the strategy. Now let's look at some practical evidence about how this works. Here's some data I put together on the relationship between wealth in countries and the level of patent protection. So this, on the vertical axis, we have the number of patent applications worldwide per person or per million residents in each country. And on the horizontal axis, wealth measured as GDP per capita or per person. And you can see there's this exponential relationship between the level of innovativeness expressed in patenting in countries and the level of wealth. Now, this is the same data expressed in logarithmic form. Each dot represents an individual country. Here's Russia, somewhere in the middle, not great, not weak, middling. To give you a couple more examples, Switzerland, which was just recently voted again as the most innovative country in the world, is right at the top in terms of patenting worldwide and wealth. USA, not at the top of the list, but it's up there. Some of the other countries think of as competitors, mainland China, People's Republic of China, actually more innovative than Russia if measured by number of patents per person, but slightly less wealthy on a per capita basis. And you can see there's this fairly clear relationship between patenting in totality as an indicator of innovation and wealth. So this is the issue we're talking about here. What is the relationship between economic development and wealth in a country and its international patenting behavior? What's our vision? So I've been doing a research project here at Skoltech looking into this question in more detail. And as part of this work, I've classified patenting into 3 categories. Now, most of the research on patenting is concerned with what I call mode 1 patenting, domestic patenting. We invent in Russia, we patent in Russia. We invent in Japan, we patent in Japan. We invent in the US, we patent in the US. The international literature is concerned more with mode 2, where foreigners invest in our country and patent in our country. But what I'm most interested in is this 3rd category, where an inventor or the assignees of an inventor, say in Japan or Russia, or United States, choose to get patents in foreign countries. And the question is, what difference does this make to business and economic development? Now, I've published a paper on this, which you can see here, which has got quite a lot of attention recently. And let me share some of the results of this research. I measured for almost every country in the world the percentage of all of its patenting worldwide, which is accounted for by this mode 3 international patenting, outward bound international patenting. And you can see a very interesting phenomenon here. In the year 2000, when we first began to collect this data, roughly a quarter of all patenting worldwide was outward bound international patenting. But this has risen until a couple of years ago to more than half, 56%. So this means that this 3rd category of patenting, which has not received that much attention in the literature, is in fact the dominant type of patenting worldwide. So we ought to take this seriously and investigate it a bit more closely. So I've taken this further and I've measured changes in patenting behaviors of countries over the 2 decades from 2000 onwards. Now in these 2 graphs, the left-hand one is the year 2000 and the right-hand one is 2016. The red dots, each dot represents a country, it's domestic patenting, and the green dots represent foreign patenting, actually outward bound international patenting. You can see that in both points of time, there's a positive relationship between outward bound international patenting and wealth between countries. But by 2016, the importance of outward bound international patenting and its impact on wealth has increased dramatically. So they both matter, but outward bound patenting seems to be critically important, more so than domestic patenting for economic development of countries. Okay, this is the same data expressed with aggregated country groups. You see a very interesting phenomenon here. The top blue line is wealthy countries. The thick brown line is all countries, and you can see that it's growing from roughly 1/3 to over a half. There's a slightly different selection of countries in this graph than the previous one, but the trend is the same. The fascinating result here is the impact of the People's Republic of China on the aggregate results. China is now leading the world in patent applications, both domestically and internationally. It's right up in the top group. Dramatic increase. But the majority of China's patent applications are domestic, oriented towards the Chinese market. So this is mode 1 patenting. And the volume of patenting in China is so large, it affects the global balance completely in this area. So this graph here shows you, if you include China in the data, that the worldwide percentage of patenting that is outward bound peaked in about 2018 and then went down again. Now, this is not because the absolute numbers are going down. They're in fact rising, but the number of domestic patent applications in China has been going down, which affects the shape of the graph. Okay, that's one fact. But overall, worldwide, it's rising as a percentage. This orange graph at the bottom represents the upper middle income countries. These are countries that are not wealthy, but they're comfortable enough. And you can see that it's flat. Basically, they've reached a kind of plateau, shall we say, the middle income trap, and are having trouble moving above it. This green line here is really remarkable. This is lower middle income countries that are obviously trying to improve their position in the world through trade and innovation and inventing, and they're dramatically increasing their outbound patterning levels. So the question is, will these poorer countries make a shift into the higher income group through their innovation strategy on a global scale? Watch this page. We'll report back on this in a year or two again. Okay, to have a more rigorous analysis of these measures that takes into account variations in the size and wealth levels of countries, I developed an index. I call it the International Patent Application Density Index, IPAD. No pun intended. Okay, this is the formula. I won't bother to go into details right now, but you can read about it in my paper. But essentially, it takes the percentage of outward bound international patenting in a country's portfolio and expresses it as a density measure on a world level, so that if all countries are performing as we'd expect, they get a score of 1. So this is this measure, IPAD. On the vertical axis, we have wealth. On the horizontal axis, we have this density measure of outward bound international patenting, and the bubble size represents the total level of inventiveness of people in a country, measured as patent applications per capita. And you see here 2 or 3 things. Firstly, there's obviously a positive relationship between outward bound international patenting and wealth. And as a general rule, you see that the size of total inventiveness makes a difference as well. What I find really fascinating here, by the way, Russia is once again in the middle here. There's a bunch of very small, wealthy countries in the upper right-hand corner that are very innovative and very aggressive in outward bound international patenting. So there seems to be a possibility that smaller, shall we say, non-dominant countries can really flourish with this outward bound orientation in intellectual property associated with technological innovation. Now, interestingly, according to the raw figures of inventiveness, patenting per person, Korea, the Republic of Korea, is the dominant one. Japan is number 2. US is fairly strong, but not the strongest. Similar to China, in fact. And so Japan is the most innovative by raw measure, but it's these small European countries, and including also Singapore, for example, that have an outward bound orientation that seem to be flourishing the most. This is the same measure looking at the correlation between wealth levels and outward bound patenting over time. And you can see that it's positive, roughly 1/3, 0.34. Now, these figures are statistically significant. You can read about that in my paper. The very poor countries aren't performing very well at all, but you can see other levels, mid-tier and wealthy countries, are converging. So a correlation of 0.3 roughly, or a bit more. Okay, I took this same data and measured changes over time. Now, what this table shows you is that there's actually evidence of a causal effect. So it's changes in outward bound international patenting precede changes in wealth levels in countries. And this is what this model here shows you, that the changes in the patenting behavior happened in the first half of the period, and the changes in the wealth level were reflected in the second half of the period. So there's evidence empirically that the patenting behavior actually influences positively economic development. It's not just a question of the rich countries patent more. This aggressive, creative, sophisticated outward bound strategy affects the wealth level of countries. Now here's the same graph, but shown for individual countries. So as I mentioned earlier, by this particular measure, if a country score is doing normal, as you'd expect, if it's average, it will get a score of 1. So for example, this yellow line here is the United States, and you see it's just slightly above average in its performance in outward bound international patenting. Switzerland, officially most innovative country in the world, is right at the top here. It dipped with the global financial crisis and other factors, but it's very strong. The really interesting case is Iceland, tiny little country, very innovative, and punching above its weight. It's got a small local market, but you can see it's pursuing the global market and using patenting at a global scale to facilitate its trade, rising very fast. Here we have Russia down at the bottom, fairly weak in outward bound patenting on a global scale, but improving slightly. And here's China, as I mentioned earlier. In fact, China is very strong in absolute terms in global patenting. It's just that this is overshadowed by its emphasis on domestic patenting. This is the same data again with the countries shown in different income groups. So you can see here that rich countries are getting more and more aggressive, more and more active with international patenting. The sort of middle level countries are sort of passive or stuck in some kind of trap at the middle income level. It's these poorer countries that seem to be doing something extraordinary to try and lift their game. So they're above average now in terms of density for international patenting. Okay, with that background, I took most countries of the world and classified them on two levels. Those that are above average in growth rate of this outward bound international patenting density, and those that are above average in growth rates in wealth. In other words, change in per capita gross domestic product over time. And using these two measures, we're able to classify countries into four groups. I call them inventors, innovators, traders, and slow movers. So the innovator group, you can see here in the top right-hand corner of the graph, are those countries which have above average growth rate in outward bound international patenting and above average growth rate in wealth per capita. Now, what's really striking about this particular group of countries is that more than 3/4 of them are the high income countries. And the group a little bit down the upper middle are roughly 1/4. So it seems that there's a strong relationship between improvement over time in outward bound international patenting and wealth, but the richer countries are doing a better job of this than the lower level countries. So it seems that success in this mutually beneficial relationship, positive cycle between international patenting and economic development is increasing the gap between rich and poor. Rich countries seem to be able to take advantage of it better than others. Now, at the other extreme, we have the countries that I call slow movers. These are countries that are not progressing in their outward bound international patenting and not progressing much in economic development. And we see here that there's a fairly strong distribution between different country groups, including rich countries, by the way, that's roughly 1/5. But this group is dominated by the lower middle income countries and low income countries. So in other words, there seems to be a relationship between improvement over time in economic level and improvement in outward bound international patenting and the level of wealth. The world's splitting into two groups, poor and rich, basically, based upon how these things are addressed. Now, the third group I call traders. These are countries that are essentially growing economically, becoming more wealthy, but it doesn't seem to have very much to do at all with trade in technology and intensive products and services that are captured in intellectual property. So these are countries that have strong tourism, raw materials, et cetera, who are continuing their kind of comfortable, well-off life with trade in areas that are not particularly subject to patenting. And the final group, I call them inventors, fascinating group. These are countries who are punching above their weight in inventing and patenting at an international level the inventions that come from their local innovators. Yet they're below average in economic development. In other words, these are countries whose people seem to be very inventive and even thinking about intellectual property, but somehow failing to translate that into economic benefit through increased economic development. And it seems to me that the explanation for this, which will be the basis of further research that me and my group at Skolkovo are doing, is that it's not enough simply to patent. It's not enough even to patent at an international level. In fact, there has to be a sophisticated strategy in targeting the patenting to the right countries, the right product areas, the right technology areas, in order to leverage the inventive capacity of local companies in the home country. So this is the question that we're looking at in my research group going forward. what features of strategy are necessary at an international scale to bring economic benefit to countries through international trade and IP. Okay, I've been talking about countries primarily, but let me give you an example of an individual company, because I think the same principles I've just explained apply to companies as well. Let me talk about Huawei, the famous company from Shenzhen in China. So you've all heard of Huawei. It's in the news quite a bit. It's active here in Russia as well as China. It's active worldwide. Huawei is a fairly young company, just over 2 decades old, started in 1987. Initially it arguably copied foreign technology and applied it in the local market, and then started developing its own indigenous technological capacity and own innovative activity in its field of technology, and then began to expand internationally. But very recently, Huawei has been thinking very carefully about intellectual property, and this is reflected in a discussion paper they published just very recently. But Huawei is right at the top worldwide in patenting, both in China and internationally. So it started out without much concern for intellectual property, but now Huawei is aggressive, active, and sophisticated in its approach, which I hope to show you in a few moments. Okay, before we look at the intellectual property strategy of Huawei, let's just take a look at its business. This is data that I got only for the most recent years, less than the last 10 years. The key message is that Huawei is very international. And in fact, up until 2 or 3 years ago, Huawei's business outside China generated more revenue than its business inside China. That's changed in the last couple of years, but nevertheless, Huawei is very international. Here's a graph that shows you its business in one particular segment, smartphones. And you can see that the Chinese market is bigger for Huawei than the global market and the external market, but they're both growing dramatically. So it's a very internationally active company. Now, here's some data I got from a very interesting data source produced by ISTEMOS, the British company, called Cipher. It has basically every patent application and patent worldwide, every country. And I was also able to get from this database information on litigation that Huawei has had to face as a defendant. In other words, it's being accused of infringing other people's intellectual property rights. And you can see the very first litigation that Huawei faced was just less than 10 years ago in 2003. And it's picked up dramatically almost two decades ago. It's picked up dramatically in the last decade. This next graph shows you Huawei's patenting activity over time since 1987 compared with its primary competitors. And you can see that Huawei, the blue company here, only started patenting around about 2003, a bit earlier, roughly the same time that it started getting litigation. So in other words, initially, Huawei's competitors were much more active in patenting than Huawei. They didn't care about intellectual property very much in their early years. But once they started expanding internationally into foreign markets, they suddenly hit obstacles with intellectual property and were hitting litigation and had to do something about it. And part of their action is to become aggressive in patenting. And you can see this is growing quite a bit. Now, this is all data just for Huawei, and it shows you the international distribution of Huawei's patenting activity in the last 2 decades. And you can see in the early years of Huawei's patenting that the majority of their patents were domestic patents inside China. But look at the recent data here. China constitutes only a small proportion of Huawei's international patenting strategy. There looks like there's a small dip in the number of patents that have happened in the last couple of years from Huawei. I suspect this is because Huawei is becoming more strategic in its choice of technologies and markets in its patenting. Nevertheless, it's a huge player, and it's predominantly an internationally oriented patenting organization. Now, this is similar information supplied by Huawei. The data I just showed you comes from publicly available sources through Cipher, but this is Huawei's own internal document. And it shows that in the early days, just a decade or so ago, the vast majority of its patenting, according to Huawei itself, was inside China. But now China is less than half of its patenting strategy. And you can see here that Europe is in fact a more dominant orientation for Huawei's patenting than is the United States. Okay, just one little example. We're running out of time, but I want you to see that not only countries benefit from a sophisticated approach to international patenting, but companies benefit as well. And we've seen this in one example, Huawei, a truly global player in the world of technology. And we see evidence that it's becoming more sophisticated over time, more targeted, more focused, more thoughtful about which fields of technology and which countries it focuses its patenting attention. So in conclusion, let me return to the theme I shared with you at the beginning. In the world of technology, it is necessary to be an international player to survive. There's very few exceptions to that rule. And that makes it necessary to be an international player in the world of intellectual property, patents in particular. And this is not just to get bigger and get more money, but in order to survive. And let me elaborate on that a little bit. It's not enough just to patent internationally. It's certainly not enough to just patent domestically, but it's not enough to patent internationally. It's necessary to have a sophisticated international patenting strategy that's linked somehow with innovation strategy and trade practice. And this principle applies to both companies and countries. So I thank you for that. The nature of the modern technology arena forces companies and countries to go global in trade, innovation, and patenting. Thank you.